Troy Franklin, Elic Ayomanor, Bhayshul Tuten, and all the waiver ads you need to know on this episode of the Sharp Angles podcast. What's up, everybody? This is the Sharp Angles podcast, the new Tuesday edition of the Sharp Angles podcast, which is going to be all about the waiver wire, talking about the biggest waiver ads of the week for fantasy football leagues. And there's a great tool you can use when you're doing waiver ads. If you do waiver ads the way you should with FAAB spending and FAAB bidding, that's the way you should go. If you're not using that, move on to that way. But if you are doing it the right way, there's this wonderful tool called FAABLab, which will help crowdsource, help you understand how much you need to bid if there's a player that you really want out there. The creator of FAABLab is a man by the name of Freeman Smith, and he is joining us this week and every week for the rest of the fantasy football season to talk about FAABLab, talk about player values, talk about how much we need to bid, historical values, all of those interesting ideas. And we're excited that he's here. How you doing, Freeman?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. Excited to talk about the best part of fantasy football, the mid-season wide receiver 5 ads and
that is where we are. There was a time whenever you would do the waiver column that, back when I started doing it, 10 years ago or whatever it was, whenever, every week there'd be a running back out there. Oh, we're going to get excited about this running back. And it just didn't happen last year. And we're now 2 weeks in and it doesn't look like it's happening yet this year. I guess if you're in a very shallow league and Jordan Mason is out there, congratulations, and go and pick up Jordan Mason. But yeah, it's been very interesting that we're talking about, like I said, Troy Franklin, Elic Ayomanor. Sorry, I say it wrong every time. Guys who I like. I mean, I had Ayomanor as an ad last week, guys who I like, but it is funny, like the level of the waiver wire has seemingly dipped in the last 2 years.
Yeah, absolutely. It's super sharp now. I think the days of Priest Holmes going down and picking up Larry Johnson off your waivers and having immediate running back one are basically dead, but it's definitely a more exciting time. I think there's a lot more value that can be grabbed out of it, especially with FAAB. You can do a lot more strategic stuff, save your waiver ads. It's a sharper game. I think it's better for it.
Yeah, and it's not like those guys could ultimately still exist. And in a very competitive league, Tyler Algier is probably rostered, but Tyler Algier actually meets the criteria for my waiver column this week over at Sharp Football Analysis. He's available in 60% of ESPN leagues, at least that. I think it's more like 64%, 65%. So like, obviously if something were to happen to Bijan Robinson, that would be a big deal for Tyler Algier. So those guys still exist, but it seems like we're having less and less of that happen. But then I say that, and we had Bucky Irving last year and we had Jordan Mason last year. There are still those guys out there. We're just still waiting for them. I do want you to talk a little bit though about FAABLab and what the purpose of FAABLab is, why people should go. It's FAABLab.app. It's a wonderful tool. You should use it every Tuesday, every Wednesday as you're setting your waivers. What is happening over there? What are you doing over there? And what's the value of it?
Yeah, so made FAABLab about 4 years ago, and basically it's a crowdsourced site, like you said. If you want to know how much you should bid on a player, you just go in and you look for that player, and then you put what you would bid. So, for example, if you wanted Harold Fannin last week, maybe you think he's worth 10% of your budget. You go in, the results are hidden until you put what your bid would be, and then they're revealed to you. And I always felt like when I was doing FAAB, especially the first few years, I had no idea like how much is Harold Fannin, a 5% guy, a 40% guy, especially when it comes to some of these running backs and possible league winners. So I thought this was a good way to try to get an insight. It ended up being pretty accurate once you get the wisdom of the crowd, as wise of a crowd of fantasy football people can be. But and it kind of blew up on Reddit. So now we get a pretty big following every week. And because that's been really relatively accurate, and I think what's been more exciting is it's grown to be a little bit more than that. And you can really get some interesting insights, because when you're just doing waivers, it's like some running back goes down, his backup's obviously the number one waiver ad. There's nothing to discuss, nothing to analyze. But with FAAB, it's sort of like doing a salary cap auction where you can really try to extract value per dollar of FAAB, or try to get wins per dollar of FAAB. And you can do some of this more interesting analytical stuff and strategic stuff, which I think is what is the most exciting part about fantasy football.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a good point. We don't have like a great running back example this week, but I guess if Jordan Mason were available in more leagues, right, there's no advice to be given for should you pick up Jordan Mason? Well, obviously, right? Like if he's available in your league, you should obviously pick him up. But how much should you spend is a different question. And I guess the answer is as much as you need to win. So that's part of it. But then is as much as you need to win, is it worth it if for these running backs? And so we're going to talk about a lot of that stuff as we go through and as those situations, show up. So I think Fannin from last week is a really good example of that. Of Fannin's a guy I liked. I think he's a guy, because we kind of talked about it offline a little bit, that you liked, but there are questions about usage and things like that. And ultimately, was I going to be willing to spend the FAAB necessary to go and get him? Well, when I went on FAABLab and saw kind of what people were spending to get Fannin, especially when a guy like Juwan Johnson was also available last week in similar number of leagues, not as many, but a similar number of leagues, then I was like, I don't know about it. And I think that that's really the key there, is trying to figure out not just how much do I have to spend, but like, is this really worth it? And I think that's a really useful tool, part of that tool that you've built over at FAABLab.
Yeah, thanks. I think what's also interesting is that with FAAB, people have different strategies, right? So if you are somebody who lost running back to an injury, right, then you really need the next 3 weeks, you need some help at the running back spot. But if you're somebody who just punted on the position of tight end, then Harold Fannin's a really good add in that situation. And we can look at sort of like positional versus situational differences and compare them to scoring. Now, the first couple of years, it was sort of like a pet project, and I started taking it more seriously the last couple of years, and I had a lot more users. So the data is admittedly a relatively small sample size, but we get some really cool insights that I think are intuitive, but maybe also surprising. Like, for example, tight ends on the first couple weeks are actually a really good use of FAAB. And I think that makes sense when you think about in the past, we've had these, Jonnu Smith, like Waller type tight ends that don't get drafted. And then you watch the first game and you realize they're a huge part of the game plan. Maybe the quarterback sees them as a safety valve. And it's just a lot more rare than a running back coming out and being surprisingly undrafted, but also having a huge role in the offense. So things like that are something that you can really extract from FAABLab. And I think it's a good way for people to figure out exactly their positional needs and waivers rather than just going for the top position.
AKA Juwan Johnson, and maybe Harold Fannin. I could be wrong about that. So
yeah, exactly.
So we will see where that goes. All right, we're going to get into talking about specific guys for this week, heading into week 3 of the season. Before we do that, though, I do want to make mention we have a great deal running on our fantasy package this season. Dominate your fantasy leagues with the Sharp Football Fantasy Package. You get detailed game previews from every matchup, from Reach Rebar, weekly player rankings, DFS analysis, waiver wire reports written by yours truly. Comes out on Tuesday morning. Everything you need to win this year. Right now, we're running a special deal for our listeners. Use code FANTASY35. That's fantasy, the number 3, the number 5. Take 35% off our rest of season fantasy package. So get you all of our fantasy football coverage all season for just $6 per week. Search sharp.football, lock in your discount, and take control of your fantasy season today. All right, let's move on and talk about a few of these receivers. You mentioned the tight ends, about how it's much more. It happens a lot more often that early in the season, a tight end that wasn't drafted will come out of nowhere and just be a bigger part of the offense. The same thing happens with receivers as well, that you get these receivers that just kind of come out of nowhere because you just have so many viable receivers that are getting playing time in these offenses. And I think two of the ones that we're going to talk about, the two receivers we're going to talk about today, are kind of in that boat. And the first is Troy Franklin, who's available in 98% of ESPN leagues. He's available in a ton. He might have got picked up in a few, deeper leagues. He's drafted in some deeper leagues. I drafted him in some best ball format, so I know he was drafted in deeper leagues. He might have been even picked up in a few more last week as well. But this week is really when we saw the breakout. He had the big game. I wish that he hadn't have had the big game, because the thing that you really like about Troy Franklin is that he ran a route on 87.5% of the dropbacks. He ran 4 more routes than Courtland Sutton. And that is just not something we've seen from Denver running backs Denver wide receivers, since the start of last season. We've seen Courtland Sutton. He's a full-time guy. He's there. And then they just kind of, rotate behind him. We saw that again in week 1 as well. That's not what we saw from Franklin in week 2. We saw Marvin Mims really fall off. I believe he had like a 40% route participation. And so the big game from Franklin, everybody can see the big game, and I get all that. But when you're trying to get excited about Franklin, you're going, they could finally let a wide receiver that's not Courtland Sutton run a whole bunch of routes. He had a big game. He had a massive target share. Like this feels like a real thing to me. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I totally agree. I really like Troy Franklin, and he was back in the day, it was really typical for somebody to take a year two leap. And I feel like we've been spoiled on rookie wide receivers the last few years where we sort of write these guys off right away. But there's so many good examples of players taking a while to get situated in the league and then having a big year two breakout. Sean Payton's an old school coach, so I think it's not surprising either that he would be an archetype for that. I think the metrics are awesome for Troy Franklin. He had great yards per out run. I think right now he's like 6th in the league for targets per out run, and he's like 14th in yards per out run. So obviously insane metrics. And he just seems like a better fit also for Bo Nix. And he's not this contested catch guy. He's really athletic, but he gets open, he gets separation, which I think with Bo Nix's ability to kind of extend the play is a better fit than just Courtland Sutton going up and catching at the catch point, going for the ball. I think that Troy Franklin is somebody who just really fits a lot better in this Sean Payton offense too. I mean, we're always trying to find like a Michael Thomas slant boy type, right? But I think he does like to run that offense where there's crisp routes, players that gain separation, and makes it easier on the quarterback. And I think Troy Franklin fits that mold a lot more than Courtland Sutton does.
Yeah, I mean, I think Courtland Sutton's going to be the guy. It is interesting that Courtland Sutton had his second or third lowest target share since the start of last season. Although the one that like really looks similar to this game for Courtland Sutton was also week 2 of last season, and then week 3 of last season he came out and had 11 targets. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, they need that secondary pass catcher. It doesn't look like it's going to be Evan Ingram. You could talk about the injury, but he ran around on like 50% of the dropbacks, and it wasn't much more than that even before the injury last week. That was a concern we had in the preseason, how they were using him in the preseason, the fact that Troutman's going to get snaps and it looks like Kroll's going to get snaps, and so they need that second guy. It doesn't look like it's going to be Mims. I was hopeful that this was going to be Mims. I was hopeful this was going to be Marvin Mims running a route on 90% of the dropbacks. We'll see what happens. This was just 1 week, but Franklin, the fact that he got that kind of usage is really nice for him. I know we don't have any bidding, like we don't have a ton of information yet up on the site. By the way, we record this on Monday ahead of Monday Night Football. So if something big happens on Monday Night Football, that's why we're not discussing it. And so we don't have a ton of bids on the site, but just with like this type of player coming off that game, any thoughts about where you think he might end up in that kind of like 10% range, or where are you thinking?
Yeah, so I can say last year this time, and I think this is indicative of how our minds are at this stage in the season. The top 2 bids go into this week last year were Carson Steele and Quentin Johnston. So I think it's a really good example of how people sort of overvalue running backs off the waiver early because the scarcity is so real. And I think Quentin Johnston's a good parallel. Hopefully Troy Franklin ends up having a better long-term season, but it's another guy who was a little quiet year 1, came out and was pretty good at the start of the second year. And he went for about 20%, which I think would be a little too much for Troy Franklin. Like, I do like him. I think he matches well with Bo Nix. The announcers can't stop talking about how they played college football together. But, I think sometimes that stuff gets really overblown. I mean, Bo Nix also played NFL football with Courtland Sutton. I feel like maybe that'll matter even more. And just in general, I've noticed a trend when looking at the past data in FAABLab that the players that go for smaller amounts, like 5 to 10%, hit almost just as much as players that end up going for 20 to 30% of your FAAB budget early in the year. And I think it's really counterintuitive because you think every week, we get so hyped up about these players, but it actually makes a lot of sense. You only get 100% of your budget, right? So you really just want as many rolls of the dice as possible. And I don't think realistically that a player going for 5% of your budget is only 50% as likely to hit as a player going for 10. And so, for example, last week this year, for 6% of your budget, you could have gotten Bucky Irving. Of course, with hindsight, it's easy to say take Bucky Irving, but I think if you make those small bids every week, you're going to end up more likely to hit on a league winner or a regular part of your roster. So I like Troy Franklin. Personally, I'd say maybe about 10% of your budget, but I think if it gets up to those Quentin Johnston last year numbers, 20% is too pricey for me.
Yeah, 10% is what came to my mind as well. So we'll have to see. One of those guys who could be in that like lower range, because we do have Troy Franklin there. I think if Troy Franklin wasn't there, maybe we'd be talking about it a little bit differently. But that's Elic Ayomanor, who I'm gonna accidentally call him Ayomanor again because I just get names wrong, as listeners to this podcast know. But I'm gonna try Ayomanor. We're gonna try Ayomanor. I mean, he's a guy that was in my waiver column last week that we told you to go out and pick up. He was somebody that we were targeting. I believe he was Rich's uncut gem on Thursday. Everything about the usage in week 1 looked great. He comes out in week 2. His route rate did dip a little bit, which that's not exciting, but it wasn't like somebody jumped up. It wasn't like Tyler Lockett played a lot more snaps. It was just kind of probably, one of those things in the game. But he's had a 21.4 target rate per route this year. He tied for the team league with 6 targets in this past game, 4 catches, 56 yards, awesome touchdown from Cam Ward. Like everything about this usage suggests that he is that number 2 receiver that we were wondering, who's that going to be for the Titans, right? Is it going to end up being Chigakonkwo? All that usage says that it's Ayomanor. We need this offense to be better. We need Cam Ward to be better. But like just from a pure opportunity perspective, the arrow is pointing way, way up for this receiver.
Yeah, and I think this is a good example of trying to find a cheaper version of the same player, because these situations are actually pretty similar, where there's an established number 1, but it's not exactly Justin Jefferson. I think we always liked Calvin Ridley, but he's never really totally lived up to the hype. And then you have this younger guy coming in who might just have better chemistry with the quarterback, and also has freak athleticism. I mean, if you just watch him play, that catch he made is something that I don't think really is in Tyler Lockett's arsenal, and even Calvin Ridley hasn't made a catch like that in a while. But I think.
By the way, before we get hate mail, Tyler Lockett's arsenal right now.
Yeah, exactly. I used to be the biggest Tyler Lockett fan. And frankly, I respect him for his always going down before getting tackled move. Yeah. But it's not something Elic Ayomanor is doing, it looks like. And I think also this is a situation where the Titans don't have to win right now. What they need is to develop their young quarterback. And the Broncos have Super Bowl aspirations, right? So they're going to play whoever gives them the best shot to win. I think if I were the Titans, I would focus on this connection between Cam Ward and Ayomanor more than Calvin Ridley, because you got this rookie on a contract, and if he becomes the next big thing, this is a perfect situation for your young quarterback. And I also think the play style works really well. Cam Ward's been scrambling a little bit more than I thought he would, extending plays, and it gives a guy like Elic Ayomanor a chance to get open, and he's just been taking advantage of these opportunities.
And Cam Ward is fun. I wanted to play better. It hasn't been great. I do think he took a step forward in his second start. Not having to play against the Broncos in Denver probably helps that, right? But it does need to be better from him. But that was his second start. But like, he's fun. Some of the plays he's made, the sidearm while falling to the ground play was just fun. I'm all in on Ward, and I'm really excited to watch his growth and as we go. The third guy we're going to talk about, and the final guy we're going to talk about today from just like the pure ad perspective, is somebody that doesn't. Yeah, I was iffy on if we should talk about this guy because he's only available in 60% of ESPN leagues. He was somebody I had on the list again last week who. You should have picked him up last week when Take Bigsby was traded. I assume he did in most super competitive leagues, but it is still interesting to talk about Bhayshul Tuten and what kind of happened this week with him and after the Bigsby trade and the kind of usage that he was getting.
Yeah, so Tuten, I think, is a perfect example of the new era of fantasy football that we're in. We talked about how you can't just pick up these running backs who are going to be starters right away. The best you can do is try to get some running backs with flex potential and contingent upside. And I think Tuten's the perfect example of that. So you mentioned Tyler Algier earlier as somebody who should be rostered. Well, if those type of guys are rostered, the Trey Benson types, Algier, Blake Corum, then Tuten's right there now. They got rid of Bigsby, showed a lot of faith in him as an RB2. And ETN was great a couple of years ago, but his advanced metrics were really bad last year. Like, there was some indication that he might be slowing down. And then you have a guy like Bhayshul Tuten come in, who was arguably the most athletic running back in coming out of college. I think he ran like a 4.31 40 or something, and just super fast. He's got relatively good hands. New coach, totally new offense. I think he just is the perfect fit as somebody who could end up being a league winner down the stretch. And when I talked about these positional values, like if you look at the average points per dollar of FAAB spent, it's really low for running backs, which is kind of surprising because you always feel like they're the ones you add. But the reason is because you're taking big swings on running backs, right? Where running backs perform better is when you look at their max points in a game after getting acquired, or their best stretch of 3 games after getting acquired. And that's because you're hoping that he ends up being the winning the job through injury or just skill and becoming the main guy. And I think no one would be surprised if a rookie with freak athleticism like Bhayshul Tuten ends up being that an RB1 down the stretch in the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, and it's tough for him because I do feel like your point about does he have like value now in deeper leagues? Like it seems like he's going to get enough touches in that kind of Tank Bigsby role where if you just need a guy to be in the flex because you're in a deep league and you're in a tough spot, especially as the buys show up, like he can definitely do that. He is very similar to Algier in that respect. He's also similar to Algier, and I in that I don't know how much work he's going to get in the receiving game. He did get 2 targets, I believe, this week, but he definitely ran fewer routes than Etienne, and I think he ran fewer routes than LeQuint Allen, who it looks like Allen's kind of more in that passing, that passing role. He ran 1 fewer than LeQuint Allen I have in my notes here. And so it is really like that secondary, running the ball kind of role but again, Tyler Algier is in that role. Braylon Allen is in that role, right? Like, and we're still interested in those guys, both for, what can they do for us, like, if we really desperately need a flex, but more than that, obviously the contingency value if something happened to Etienne. I do think it would require something to happen to Etienne. I don't think we're going to see just like a split, like enough of a Tuten taking control of this backfield because Etienne has just been good for 2 weeks. You're right. Last year it wasn't as good, but it has been good. So we'll have to see kind of where that goes. But yeah, this is what you have to do is pick these guys up. You mentioned Corum. By the way, Corum's available in like 95% of ESPN leagues, and it started to look a lot more like a timeshare this week against the Titans. And I still don't really know what that's about. I haven't seen any reporting. I kind of dug a little bit to see what that was about. Obviously, Kyren Williams didn't have a good game in that game, but yeah, it was, that's like the first time I've looked at the Kyren Williams Corum, and Kyren Williams just got a lot of money. I think Kyren Williams is going to be fine, but just something to put on your radar, I would say, with Blake Corum is kind of what we saw against the Titans.
Yeah, totally. I think that Blake Corum one was interesting because people were saying that it was a game script dependent thing, but then a lot of other starters with a lot more questionable health were still in the game. So it wasn't exactly like they were just putting in the second stringers. We've always seen McVay just roll with one running back basically, but I mean, Kyren Williams might be the most faded running back in fantasy football, right? So there would be a celebration in the streets if he lost his job to Blake Corum. And it's not like Blake Corum's this electric back either, but he's a similar role. And I think Sean McVay really just looks for somebody to trust and let his defense and passing game do the rest of the work. So I think Blake Corum has an interesting path because if Kyren ever did screw up, fumbles or something like that, he might start getting a lot more run, whereas I think a guy like Bhayshul Tuten, you're probably right. He needs an injury or just to look like even better version of Bucky Irving to end up getting real RB1 run in that offense.
All right, so those are our 3 top guys we wanted to talk about. I do want to talk about a few deep cuts. Before we get there, I do want to remind you, you can use promo code FANTASY35, that's the number 35, for 35% off our rest of season fantasy package over at sharpfootballanalysis.com. Also, subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We really do appreciate your support. So, make sure you do that. So I have my deep cut section in my waiver column every single week with running backs and wide receivers. These are running backs and wide receivers available in at least 95% of ESPN leagues. This is for all you not in my league degenerates, of which I am a part of that group. So I'm with you. I say degenerates with love because I'm certainly part of that group. And I just want to talk about a few players. The first player I wanted to talk about, I'm surprised he's in this group. This is a player I think I ended up with like 45% of him at Underdog and at DraftKings when I was drafting best ball, because I was like, why is this guy just last when Jaden Reed has a broken foot? And that's Dontayvion Wicks. And Dontayvion Wicks has burned enough of us that we're all probably wary, but he's available in 99.8% of ESPN leagues. He ran just 3 fewer routes than Romeo Doubs with Jaden Reed off the field on Thursday night. He led the team in targets in that situation. And like, we've been here before with Wicks. Like I even did a meme one time that this is Dontayvion Wicks. He's a great receiver. He's always open. The problem is he doesn't catch the ball. He hasn't dropped one yet this year. So, we'll see. But, Golden, they're not using him a ton. Obviously, they have Doubs. Reed's not going to be there for a while. Watson's not going to be there for a while. There's just a role here for Wicks. Like, he's just a slam dunk ad, not even a deep cut ad. Like, if you're in deep league, he's just a slam dunk ad, right, at this point?
Yeah, I think Wicks is the kind of guy that is really hard to give up on because of the athleticism. And, it's not like the other Packers wide receivers are notoriously good at actually hauling in the ball. It looks like Golden is sort of living up to what a lot of the dynasty guys were saying, of being like a pretty slow prospect and maybe more of a gadget player. So I definitely like this ad. I know people are going to say Romeo Doubs is running more targets, getting more play as the wide receiver 1, and I can understand that. Just when you're looking, it's like what I said earlier. You're trying to take a bunch of rolls of the dice, and I think you know what you're getting with Romeo Doubs. Whereas if Wicks could clear up some of the drop issues, I mean, last year everybody was really high on him, but Jordan Love is also pretty banged up, so I think he was trying to get the ball out a lot quicker. And Dontayvion Wicks could be a high depth of target guy who ends up winning downfield more than like the Jaden Reed type slot gadget role. So I think there's a lot more value in there, but I definitely wouldn't bid more than a few percent on him. You can probably almost add him for free.
Yeah, and I think that's probably where we are with him. But the thing about Golden, Golden, I'm still high on Golden. And Freeman, you weren't with us in the offseason. I was high on this entire Packers passing game. I drafted a ton of Jordan Love, drafted a ton of Tucker Kraft. That's looking pretty good right now. I drafted a ton of Wicks. I drafted a ton of Golden. Golden was like inches away from 2 big plays in that game. And so on Thursday night. So I'm not selling Golden yet, but I mean, they just have room in that offense, especially if that offense is, as you mentioned, last year, it was very run heavy because Jordan Love was, hurt. And now we're seeing them throw more. We think they're a bit of a juggernaut. We'll see if the defense is that good, then, maybe they just don't have to throw in the second half, and there we are. But yeah, I'm just buying in on this passing game. And like you said, with Romeo Doubs, we know what he is. He's going to catch touchdowns sometimes. Jordan Love likes him. He's going to be out there. He's going to run routes. He has never particularly been a high target rate per route kind of guy. And so, yeah, just taking that shot on Wicks. Another kind of lower end guy that you maybe want to take a shot on is Tory Horton. I'm a little bit less excited about that one because he was only on the field for 50% of the dropbacks. Obviously made the most of it, but this Seattle offense really looks like it's going to be Rams 2.0, Eagles 2.0, and that we're just looking at a massive target share for Jackson Smith and Jigba, a smaller but still big target share for Cooper Kupp, and then everybody else is fighting for scraps. So I just don't. Horton will be a name, especially in deeper leagues, that people are paying attention to because he had the game. But I don't know how excited I'm getting about him. How about you?
Yeah, I think in these more run-first offenses, it's really hard for 2 guys to emerge. We're always trying to make it happen. And the only way it really does is, like you said, if it's just 2 players that are taking like over 50% of the target share between the 2 of them. So I could see a path because I think the ghost of Cooper Kupp might not be around for too long, even though I think he didn't look too bad in week 2. So I think
he played good and he played well. His metrics in week 2 looked as good as Jackson Smith and Jigba. So we'll see.
Yeah,
we'll see.
Tory Horton was like the absolute prototypical buzz out of camp guy. I feel like in
absolutely.
the preseason you kept hearing about him, and a lot of times those things are just noise. But
they cut Marquise Valdes-Scantling. Like there's a reason why. You know what I'm saying? Like. They like that guy for sure, but like you said, they're a run-first offense. So
yeah, and what I think is kind of weird is you saw Darnold be so successful last year in Minnesota by running a lot of play action and then hitting players deep. Like Addison had another good year, and Seattle was like a really low play action rate, and I think that they'll maybe come around to that once they can get the run game going a little bit better. They might decide they need a second wide receiver to try to open up that offense a little bit. And I could see that being Tory Horton. I couldn't really see Cooper Kupp doing much for the play action Sam Darnold passing game, but we'll have to see what kind of role Tory Horton ends up playing with JSN taking like a ridiculous 60% target share.
I didn't write it down. I just pulled up my notes really quick because I did make note of the fact that they did a lot more play action and motion in week 2 than they did in week 1, but I did not write the numbers down in my notes. So that's thank you, past Raymond, for not doing that. But to your point, they did run a lot more play action. And then finally, I think we have to talk about the Washington backfield situation with, unfortunately, the injury to Austin Eckler, who every fantasy player in the world is sad to see Austin Eckler suffer that injury, not just because he was an awesome fantasy player, but he's one of us.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, an absolute advocate for degenerates.
Absolutely. So we're super sad to see it, but it does open up, an interesting situation. Eckler had a very specific role in that offense with Bill Krosky-Merritt in the more, like early down guy, and Eckler playing as like the veteran that they trust, and also in passing situations. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I do think Chris Rodriguez is going to be a hot name on the wire. I just don't know. He doesn't really fit that role, right? Like that's not what we expect from Chris Rodriguez to step into that Eckler role.
Yeah, it's really interesting because if you just look back at like past performances when Chris Rodriguez has gotten some run, looks really good. He's been good at the goal line, good yards per carry, things like that. But yeah, it's pretty obvious back-to-back healthy scratches that they didn't feel they needed him with Austin Eckler and Jeremy McNichols there, which makes me think that if anything, he would be like the backup to everybody's favorite Bill Krosky-Merritt role. And as much as we love Bill, and obviously if you have him, you're probably feeling pretty good right now. He still is not really involved in the pass game, and I think that he's going to end up paying off his late round stash value. But he was a 7th round pick. He didn't even get invited to the combine, so I think they like him a lot, but I think there's no chance that they end up making Bill a workhorse. I think they're going to have some veteran guy there. And Jeremy McNichols actually ran a lot of routes. So I don't really see a path for Chris Rodriguez he doesn't seem like he's going to be the pass catching guy. He might get a little goal line work, but then you also have a mobile quarterback to take a lot of those goal line touches. So I don't really see the path, but you can probably add him for free and see what happens next week. I think that'd be pretty smart.
Yeah, I am interested to see how excited people get about Rodriguez, just because he's a name that we've talked about previously, because he was a name that after the Brian Robinson Jr. trade came up, right? Like he was a guy, I mentioned him on one of our DraftKings drafts that we were doing about like, I don't know, maybe we should think about it that, I thought it was going to be Bill Krosky-Merritt, right? I thought that was going to be the guy that stepped into that early down role next to Eckler, but who knows? We should maybe think about Rodriguez. So I do wonder if he's more popular than somebody else might be, but like your point, even when he was getting a lot of run at the end of his rookie season, the most routes he ever ran in a game was 10. That's just not who he is. And I do think people might be surprised at how much Jeremy McNichols plays. And if we're talking about deep cuts, maybe that's the way we need to go. They signed Chase Edmonds to their practice squad. That's normally, the path. I wouldn't be surprised if he's elevated this week. They could, certainly look in the trade market. They're also dealing with potentially a Jaden Daniels injury. We're, again, recording this on Monday. We don't know. Lots of moving parts here in Washington, but I would say don't get too excited about Chris Rodriguez, even in deeper leagues, but, we'll see. All right, that's it for us. Make sure you head over to Sharp Football Analysis. Check out my waiver column. It'll be up Tuesday morning at some point. I try to get it up before everybody wakes up. We'll see if I reach that goal on Tuesday morning. Make sure you go and check out, though, FAABLab to figure out, all right, how much do I need to bid on this player? Is this player worth it? All of that's available on FAABLab. It is a wonderful resource to use for waivers. I use it for waivers. I've been linking to FAABLab for at least 2 seasons now, I think, because I think it's such a valuable resource. I'm so excited that Freeman's able to join us and talk about it. So make sure you go and check that out. Also, make sure you subscribe to us wherever you find the podcast. If it's in a podcast player, if it's on YouTube, a lot of content available from Warren Sharp, from myself, from Rich Rebar, from Ryan McChrystal, from Joe Gibbs, all of that available through the week. Make sure you subscribe, and we really appreciate the support, and we'll talk to you soon.